North American
David,
accent. That would be what?
I'm joking. I don't think
Oh,
his
okay,
his accent sounds intelligent at all.
Well, I mean, compared to my hillbilly cousins, he does.
You have a pretty good Peterson impersonation, don't you? Or is that AP?
AP is actually better. I'm shocked. I did not think of AP as an impression guy, but if he practices for a while, he can actually get good at some certain impressions.
Off topic, but did you see Oompaville? No, I can't really do it. I'm just trying to read out the super chat. Oompaville react to the Wes Huff Billy Carson debate. Do you guys know who Oompaville is?
No.
He cooked Billy so many being reached from God using Wes. Yeah, Wes is awesome. Pray for him though. Right now he's trying to finish his PhD. So all of this is sort of giving him a distraction from finishing his PhD. So everyone watching this, say some prayers for Wes so that he can finish his PhD and officially become Dr. Wesley Huff. So all right, let's go now to our first clip. This one is from the opening statement from Alex, and this is where he lays out his version of the problem of evil. This clip is about a little over a minute long, and this one kind of sets up, I think, the tone for the whole video, for at least from Alex's side.
Who's this guy with him? Phil who?
I think it's his son, Stuart. I mean, they have the same last name.
No, I know who Stuart is. I mean, Phil. This Phil guy.
Phil, he is Skydive Phil. He's a long-time like atheist blogger. He's got his own YouTube channel. Is he an actual skydiver or something? Is that what he calls him? Yes, he does skydive. Apparently, he even talked about that in this debate. So, yeah, he does do some skydiving. But he's interviewed. I'm blanking on their names, but pretty much all of the top atheists, like scientists, who have been talking about religion lately. He's pretty much interviewed them. I think even in person. To make videos on the fine-tuning argument, the Kalam and stuff. So he's very active in this, and I think he's going to start to gain a little bit more popularity as a result. Not necessarily as a result of this debate alone, but he does seem to be pretty active right now. So I'm not focusing too much on him in this review, just because I mean I think he said a lot of false things, but that's not really my focus. My focus here is on Alex, mainly because, and I didn't mention this, and I should, mainly because my expectations of Alex are so high. Part of that, again, is because I've met him in person. I know how smart he is. But also, I think he's very open in a way that a lot of other atheists online, other atheist content creators are not. I think Alex is genuinely open to being wrong, to advancing in his philosophical thinking. And so it's really disappointing to me when I see him making these claims. Even if I'm wrong in the things that I've said in response to Alex, like at least say something or like acknowledge it or I don't know. Yeah. And maybe I'm thinking too highly of myself here, but the points that I'm making are pretty standard responses. Like there are theodicies, animal soul building theodicies. There are theodicies in the literature on animal suffering. And Alex is just not interacting with them. So all right, let's play this first clip. I'll also remind the audience really quickly that David's PhD is in the problem of evil. If you guys didn't know that, so David's going to have, I'm sure, a lot of thoughts on this. But let's start with this first clip.
Nice. Not only this, but Phil's already mentioned the problem of animal suffering. It's worth reflecting that the problem of evil has a number of well-thought-out responses called theodicies. Evil exists because of higher-order goods that can only be attainable if there's some kind of suffering in the world. Free will means that we need to be able to commit free evil acts. Evil helps our souls to develop and grow closer to God, this kind of stuff. Please keep in mind that none of them, are effective in explaining the existence of non-human animal suffering. Animals do.
Okay, I'm pausing it there because this is the claim that he makes, right? None of the theodicies that exist right now are effective at explaining non-human suffering, animal suffering. And he knows there are these theodicies exist. Okay, we're gonna. I don't know that we need to necessarily run through them. We can, if we need to, we can kind of explain some of these if you guys want us to. They exist, and Alex needs to acknowledge that. Like, he needs to, I think, publicly acknowledge the fact that there are theodicies that exist that philosophers have been working on. And a theodicy, if you don't know, we've been using this word a lot. If you don't know what a theodicy is, it's just a reason that God has for allowing the suffering in the world. And this is a particular type of suffering that he's focusing on. He and Phil in this debate are focusing on animal suffering. So they want to say, you know, animals, when you talk about free will, free will doesn't explain why animals suffer, because they don't have free will, right? They're not rational creatures. They don't have the ability to choose between good or bad, because they're not rational. They're not conscious. They're unaware of what's going on. So they want to say that those theodicies that people typically appeal to, someone like Cliff, someone like Stuart, they're going to appeal to, you know, free will to explain why they're suffering in the world. And they want to say, well, it doesn't explain animal suffering. It's just a plain fact that it is false, that there are no theodicies that are effective at explaining non-human suffering. You might think that they don't work or something along those lines, but at least acknowledge them, at least interact with them, say something, like at least name it and say, well, okay, that doesn't work for this reason, you know. I can continue this clip here, but do you guys have any other thoughts before we continue?
No, the one thing I'll just add on really quick here, just in case there's any lack of clarity here. Alex is, in this case, making a really strong claim that none of these can even begin to explain animal suffering. It's not the case that he said, these are attempts and I think they fail. He said straight out, they do not explain animal
No, he
suffering.
said they're not effective. They're not effective at explaining.
Okay.
No, he did say they're not effective at explaining non-human suffering.
Yeah, then I would like to hear why.
Yeah, I would say on kind of a surface level, if you're taking sort of the surface level theodicies and so on, you can see why he's pointing out. And I'm saying this because, you know, as someone who's debated, sometimes you toss out an objection, and you're basically giving your opponent the opportunity to respond to it and to say, no, these theodicies can explain this. But so for anyone who isn't familiar with what's going on here, so you have theodicies, and I think Alex just mentioned free will theodicies and soul building. There are dozens of theodicies. These are explanations for why God might allow, reasons for God to allow various kinds of evil, natural evil in the world. And what Alex is pointing out there is that some of the most common theodicies, like God respects our free will, but therefore must also give us the ability to misuse our free will. Alex is saying, in effect, what's that got to do with animals? Why would that have something to do with animals? And then soul building, that because human beings go through different kinds of struggles, we can develop virtues like courage and so on. And therefore, it's ultimately good for us. You go through bad things, but it's for a good purpose. And he's saying, what does that have to do with it? William Rowe gave the most famous example of a deer who gets horribly burned in a forest fire or something like this and suffers for a few days. Nothing good ever comes out of that. And so he's basically saying, hey, the standard theodicies that people give, they don't apply to this other category of animal suffering. And then sounds like Cameron is saying, actually, there are theodicies. And you could even apply the theodicies that he mentioned in a way that they have something to say about animal suffering. But
oh, yeah. The free will theodicy can be extended to include animal suffering. So can the soul building theodicy.
Yeah.
These are not news. These are...
That's what the last thing I wanted to say, which is just, Alex has gone into the literature about animal suffering to the point that, and I would agree with him, the people that deny that animals suffer in any kind of meaningful sense, I would agree with Alex that that's false. The problem is when you look at that literature, on top of that, you also find that animals can have the capacity, not to the extent humans can, but they have the capacity to reflect and find meaning in their lives. They have purpose in their lives. But I don't know how you can say that and then also say something like the saint-making theodicy doesn't apply to animals.
Yeah, there's a 2014 book on animal suffering from Trent Doherty. Again, that's been out since 2014, and
yeah.
I'm pretty sure I remember pointing it out to Alex. I've mentioned it on numerous occasions. A lot of people don't think that it works, but again, it exists. Like, acknowledge it, interact with it, give some sort of reason to think that the theodicy fails. and we're not hearing any of that. And what he says here, you know, Cliff and Stuart, these guys are preachers. They're not going to know about these theodicies or different ways that, you know, these really highfalutin philosophers have tried to extend the theodicies to actually still take care of animal suffering. Like these guys, and Alex knows this. Alex knows that Cliff is just a regular dude. Like he's a pastor. He's not a philosopher. And this is what was embarrassing to me when I was hearing Alex explain this, is that it's just yeah, it's just bad. But let's continue this clip. We got another 30 seconds on it, and then we'll get some more comments on it.
Do not make free moral decisions. They do not have moral souls that can develop through strife. It's controversial even to suggest that they'll simply be compensated in some kind of fluffy afterlife.
Yeah, I'm gonna talk about that part in just a minute, because in the video that I mentioned earlier, this response that I made, this 40-minute response that I made 2 years ago, we're gonna watch an argument that I gave in that video, which gives an argument for animal immortality in the afterlife. Again, this stuff exists. You can go interact with it if you want to, but to say that it's like, you know, super controversial without interacting with any of the arguments for it, it's just, yeah, I don't like it.
I want to hear today a direct answer. How can the suffering of a deer on its own in a forest, with its leg broken and trapped under a tree, already starving in confused agony, before being predated upon by having a mountain lion clasp the deer's windpipe in its jaw for an excruciating, minutes-long death, be explained? It's supervised by an omnipotent invigilator who, if for some reason could not prevent this particular event, seemingly could have at least designed the machinery of the natural world to be less prone to this kind of thing.
Yeah. So that's basically the end of his little spiel. He didn't have a ton of time to kind of lay out his argument. Oh, by the way, David, if you don't, I don't think I announced this at the beginning. The topic of their debate is whether or not the biblical God exists, which is a little bit strange that he's even talking about the problem of evil. We'll talk about this a little bit later.
Yeah,
it's a little bit strange.
Wait. Yeah, matter of fact, in a weird way, that kind of makes his argument less effective, because the God of the Bible wouldn't allow suffering. Like, what are you talking about?
Okay. Later on, I've got a clip of this. Phil says that the problem of evil is an internal critique, is like an internal problem for Christians. I've had. Oh man, this is gonna trigger me.
I'm glad you brought that up, Cameron, because a thing that Alex said that I didn't catch the first time was that Alex just kind of smuggled in this part of his argument that that animals don't have souls. But it's like, I actually haven't really talked to any Christians that believe that. So is this an actual internal critique or not? Like, Alex kind of smuggles that in as a way to like support his argument because of his perceived model of Christianity.
Yeah, it's so weird. It's so weird. So weird.
It's also weird. It's also weird. Little side note. So the example he gave was the exact same example that I brought up as the most famous example, because that was
not
William
the exact
Rose.
Same. It's very close. Very close. Still
That
involves
was,
a deer.
Yeah, so you have William Rose. Yeah, he said dies after minutes or something like that.
He said that there's like a lion that comes and bites its neck and stuff. I think in Rose's case, it was like
it was a forest fire. It was a forest fire, something like that. Okay, so deer in the woods. But what's interesting about that, so Roe, for everyone who's watching, historically, the argument from evil was presented as a kind of logical problem, that if you have these certain beliefs, you have an internal inconsistency in your thinking. If you believe in an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good being, and you believe that evil and suffering exists, you actually have a contradiction in your thinking. Alvin Flanagan famously destroyed that, and William Rowe took things in an evidential direction, where he's saying it's not that you have a contradiction in your thinking, it's just that evil and suffering of various kinds provide a kind of evidence against the existence of God. So lots of people are familiar with that. Anyone who takes a course in philosophy of religion or something like that, William Rowe's going to come up in there, and you're going to have to read his famous article. But most people don't know, William Rowe eventually rejected his own arguments. He actually agreed with the skeptical theists. that to make an argument out of that, to say, oh, look at this suffering, I can't think of any reason for a good God to allow this suffering, therefore there probably is no reason, therefore there probably is no God. He said, we have smuggled in the assumption that if God had reasons for allowing these kinds of suffering, we would have access to those reasons. And he said, and there's no good reason to assume that. So he, towards the end, took things in a Bayesian direction, like Paul Draper. He offered a Bayesian argument from evil to try and avoid the mistake of his earlier arguments. And so, yeah, guys, it's important to keep in mind that the people who've offered these arguments and popularized them sometimes reject their own arguments, and people don't pay attention to their refutation of their own argument, but they still cling to the old argument. Just like you'll still have atheists who cling to the logical argument from evil, even though almost no one at the philosophical level takes that seriously anymore.
I was going to say, Than, you mentioned Bayes. Than is a big Bayes guy. I like it too.
Yeah,
why don't we do this
with Bill Humpty?
let's do this. So I'm gonna go over this argument that I gave in this video, which I honestly think Alex was planning to do a response to it, but then just never got around to it. So he may just not have even watched it. But this is an argument based on a paper from Dustin Crummett, where he gives this is one of the arguments. I think he gives 6 arguments in his paper for animal immortality, and this is one of those arguments. And Alex has reason to endorse or accept every single premise. And so to say that, like, you know, he was using a lot of rhetorical flourishes in the debate in his opening statement, like, oh well, you know, there's no fluffy afterlife and stuff. Like, please interact with the stuff. Please interact with the literature. Premise 1, if an agent can benefit an individual with moral standing, and there is no sufficiently good reason for the agent not to provide the benefit, the agent has a duty to so benefit the individual. Premise 2, non-human animals with interests are individuals with moral standing. By the way, I do go into a defense of the premises in just a second, so we'll watch that too. It's not very long. Premise 3, God is an agent who can benefit non-human animals with interests by giving them eternal, infinitely good afterlives. 4, there is no sufficiently good reason for God not to do so. 5, God has a duty to benefit non-human animals with interest by giving them eternal, infinitely good afterlives. That follows from 1 through 4. 6, God acts in accordance with God's duties. 7, animal universalism, i.e. the view that all non-human animals with interests will receive an eternal, infinitely good afterlife, is true. And this follows from premises 5 and 6. Let me point this out before we get to the defense of the premises, that this is a logically valid argument. So in order to avoid the conclusion of animal universalism, you have to reject one of the premises in the argument. And so if you present this to somebody who is trying to give this argument from evil, focusing on animal suffering, and you give them this argument, they've got to reject one of the premises if they want to reject the conclusion that animal universalism is true. Okay? Just want to point that out before we get into a defense of these premises. All right, so let's now go through these premises one by one and just give a quick defense of them. So the first premise seems pretty straightforward. If I could heal a terminally ill stranger in Europe by pressing a red button, and I have no good reason not to press the button, it seems pretty obvious, seems like at least, that I'm obligated to press it. Premise 2 basically just says that some animals are owed some kind of moral consideration. And I don't think that this is a premise that Alex, a proponent of ethical veganism, can reasonably deny. As an So he's now, I think, flipped on this. So right, he's no longer an ethical vegan. It's been a while since this video came out, but nevertheless, I think he still would endorse this premise: non-human animals with interests are individuals with
even
moral
if
standing.
you're putting up the argument from animal suffering, it seems
exactly
that you're going to entail.
Yeah, you've got to endorse this premise. Ethical vegan, Alex believes that animals are owed moral considerations, i.e. we shouldn't factory farm them. Premise 3 is also pretty obvious. Animal immortality seems to be within the metaphysical boundaries of God's omnipotence. One objection that you might have to this premise is that God is not a moral agent. He doesn't have any moral obligations. So I don't think that Alex would necessarily raise this objection, but many theists might. So I'll just quickly note that the argument could be recast in terms of perfect love instead of moral obligations. It's not that big of a deal. So as for premise 4, as a proponent of the problem of evil, 4 is actually a premise that Alex should be inclined to accept if you just look at it. 5 follows from 1 through 4. Premise 6 is also pretty obvious. Even if God has 0 moral obligations, it's still true that for any duties he has, he complies with them. All right. Okay, so we've got an argument here for animal universalism and animal immortality. We've got to see some interaction with this. Atheists need to start interacting with this when they level the problem of animal suffering. Please, guys, if you any small time atheist YouTubers, any big time atheist YouTubers that are watching this video, if any of this is triggering you, please respond to arguments like this.
Where is this in the Bible? That's the typical.
I actually did. You know what's funny is that I did provide some passages that support animal immortality in this video. So if you guys want to go check those out, I just put them on the screen really quickly. Yeah, David, what are your thoughts on this argument? I'll pull it up back on the screen so you can see. There we go.
Really, as far as this argument is concerned, if Alex is saying that that animal suffering is some kind of evidence that the God of the Bible doesn't exist or something like that, then yeah, he would have to rule out responses like this. I just want to point out he's got a problem either way. Like even if you weren't appealing to some sort of afterlife for animals or something like that, which he can't rule out. Like how do you know God isn't going to do something like this? You've offered an argument for why God would or could, but as far as it's like okay, you have to rule this out. Then in addition to that, even if animals had no afterlife and so on, there are responses to animal suffering, and so it's just, I don't know, it's always the animal suffering. I see why they go in the direction of animal suffering, because it is more difficult to apply human-centered theodicies to animals, and so it's a kind of like, aha, I got you.
It's honestly not that hard.
It's not.
It's not that hard. It's not that.
I say harder. Yes, it is. If I'm talking about human beings developing virtue and so on, people tend not to think of animals in that way, even though animals can learn and so on. So and it's always built into the idea that we're talking about human beings who are developing virtues that are going to extend, on to eternity and so on. So you're talking about some big picture type stuff, whereas you're thinking about your cat dying and, breaking its leg and something like that, then you normally wouldn't apply that same kind of reasoning to human. To be fair, no, I think there are all kinds of theodicies, including free will theodicy and soul building theodicy, that you can apply to animals if you actually expand on things and flesh things out. But yeah, I don't think it's. Yeah, I just don't see it as really particularly strong evidence against the existence of God once you put everything on the table.
Yeah, we're also going to get into some stuff in a little bit on some of the claims that they make on the side of atheism, where they make these really sad claims. I mean, I'm calling them sad. It's almost worse than that. But like a lot of atheists will say, "Oh, well, evil and suffering is expected. What I would expect if atheism were true." And it triggers me to no end.
I would expect nothing if atheism. Yeah, that's
dude,
what I would.
It triggers me to no end when atheists make this claim. It just where is this prediction coming from?
Yeah.
I don't.
By the way, just so you know, and it's good that we're getting there, because that's my ultimate problem. That is my ultimate problem with.
I've got a good analogy for it, actually, too.
With the problem of evil, like based on expectations, and what they're thinking is, yeah, if you had a universe and if you had life, and if evolution is the only game in town of how you got there, then that would involve suffering. So therefore, if you're actually like abstracting and just saying, okay, let's start off, no creator versus a creator, what are you expecting? Go. Like, okay, well, on one, I might expect something to be created. On the other one, I would expect nothing.
Yeah.
So right there. And then you say, okay, if you got a universe on either hypothesis, what would you expect? Go. Well, on the God hypothesis, I might expect a finely tuned universe, because God would have reasons to, make living things. On the other side, I would expect, since it's vastly more probable to get a non-life permitting universe, I'd expect a non-life permitting universe if you got one at all. And so you just kind of go down the line, and then, okay, would you expect life? Well, I would on the theistic hypothesis, or at least much more so than on the non-theistic hypothesis. You can kind of go down the road all to life, to human consciousness, to our reasoning ability, to our moral sense, and so you can, and it becomes like insanely more probable. All the evidence massively favors theism over atheism. So when it's just, oh, well, we had expected on our hypothesis, but not on yours. It's like, have you seen what you need for your argument to even work over here? Have you seen all the things within your claim that fit massively better with theism than they do with atheism?
Right.
How are you putting together like 50 things, all of which favor theism over naturalism, and you somehow say it all adds up to favoring naturalism? It sounds insane to me.
Dude, you hit the nail on the head, and
Yeah.
I've got an amazing. The next clip we're gonna play is amazing. It's gonna show you the different like things that they have to work into their hypothesis.
Yeah.
Oh man. Than, do you have anything to add to what David just?
No,
kinda
I
said
mean,
there?
David did a really good job on his rant with my problem here, and I'll save my rant for when we play the clip.
Okay. So this next one,
Just one more thing. Going to your particular argument. So, I think that skeptical theism makes some very, very important points. Namely, that we basically know the tiniest little bit of what God would know, and therefore it's kind of weird when we proceed as if in our argumentation we know what God's thinking in all of this, or we know God's reasons. So as far as you putting forward your argument there, to me it's like, whether I agree with it or not, it's the idea is that there are these possibilities. It's like, okay, is that something that God could be thinking? Yes, absolutely. Do I know that God's thinking that? No. But it's like, if we can come up with possible reasons for God to allow suffering, so free will theodicies, soul building theodicies, and dozens of other theodicies, and we can say these are all possible reasons for God to allow some suffering or all the suffering we see. Do we know that this one is correct or that one is correct or something like that? No, for me it's like, okay, if we with our little bit of information can come up with all these possible reasons, and God would know massively more than us, it's almost like, how can you say with a straight face there can't be these reasons, when even given our limited intellect we can come up with all kinds of them, especially ones that fit with the God of the Bible. That's kind of my thinking in all this. So in other words, when you give an argument, I don't think, okay, does this argument prove your case? So it's like, okay, does this argument show there's a possible theodicy that would apply in this situation? Sure, absolutely.
Let's get through a couple super chats here before we get to the next clip, and this one I think is pretty important. Based Autistic said he was looking forward to watching the live stream tonight, but his father, or he or she, had a heart attack. If you guys could pray, his name is Steve, I would deeply appreciate it. Thank you. God bless. So anyone here that is a Christian, please pray for Steve. You can pause the video, you can do it right now, or you can do it after the video ends, but please say a prayer.
Earlier, I mentioned I went to one question at the first question of the Q&A, but that was Based Autistic who asked the question in the debate.
Oh wow.
No.
All right, let's cover a couple more super chats here, and then we'll get to the next clip. Dr. Huff sounds like he sells extracurriculars. I don't really know what that means.
I don't know what that means either.
Well, the last name, Huff.
Oh, okay, Huff.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, Gwyneth Isaac says, animals don't have free will, but they do suffer the effects of the fall, including death and suffering. It's curse on the whole earth. Yeah, no, this I think is also Cliff's response. Yep. Phil and Alex point out that, there was animal suffering before the fall, and so how do you explain that? And so you've got to have some sort of theodicy that extends beyond that, unless you want to say that the fall is a sort of it can kind of reach back in time, so to speak. Well, that's a little bit wacky.
If you look at a lot of the scholarship on early Israelite religions, Michael Heiser is a big person that people love talking about. he'll point out that early Israelites didn't kind of conceive of one fall. There's typically like multiple falls that some people will even talk about, like a pre-human fall where the rebelling divine council members rebelled against God and stuff like that. And so it gets a little deeper than that. But
well, yeah, and then the
that's
freedom
something you
there,
can
I
kind
mean,
of
often,
test
yeah, that's one area where free will, the free will theodicy, can be extended to animal suffering. That fall, yeah. So
Yeah, and guys, so we mentioned theodicies. Want to be clear, like theodicies are philosophical responses to why a god with certain attributes, usually all-knowing, all-powerful, and perfectly good, why that sort of god would allow the kinds or varieties of human and animal suffering that we see around us. When you're talking about a religion, then you can actually have religious explanations, like if you're talking about Judaism or Christianity or Islam or something like that. And now you start talking about human beings are sinners. We live in a fallen world, things like that. And so that's why earlier when we were talking about the topic being the biblical God, we were like, wait, what? Because now you're dealing with a God who is aware of human sin and so on. And so how does that God interact? Well, you have that in the Bible. So in other words, long story short, if you read the Bible, how can you think that animal suffering is inconsistent or human or animal suffering is inconsistent with the God of the Bible? It's kind of taken for granted. And so weird to think that it would be inconsistent. Whereas if you're just starting off with a philosophical concept, then you don't have all that.
So Caleb is talking about kind of the same thing we were just talking about. That's why I wanted to cover it really quickly. He says free will can work as a theodicy if one argues that animal suffering is a result of free non-human agents like demons or Elohim. Alex ignores this. Yeah, Alex ignores this. Atheists ignore this. And really what they do is they express incredulity about it. So they basically just say, oh, well, that's stupid, whatever. Yeah, don't need to take that seriously. And that's not how you do philosophy. It's not how you do argumentation or logic or anything like that. What you need to do is give some sort of reason to reject it, or especially if you're trying to provide some kind of internal critique of Christianity that literally outlines this in the Bible. Like
the Bible outlines a whole meta narrative of what you're going to expect to see about reality, and then when you see the things that the meta narrative says you're going to see, you somehow act like that's evidence against it.
Yeah, that's so dumb. But yeah, I mean, even in this debate, they want to say that it's this internal critique. Internal to what? Internal to what? And if it's internal to Christian doctrine, then guess what? You've got to interact with this and give some, I don't know, say something about it other than just laughing at it.
Just let me say a few words on this. I always try to break things because there's something called the curse of knowledge, namely that you guys understand what this person is talking about, but there are always people in the chat who don't understand. Like, what?
Oh, I was mainly talking about demons. I think everyone knows about demons. I wasn't talking about the Elohim part.
Yeah,
is that what you're about to?
No, I mean with the demons, like people think, what, demons causing animal suffering? What? That's crazy. That's insane. I just wanted people to know like what the role is in all this argumentation. So I mentioned that once upon a time, for most of the time that this argument has been used, the problem of evil, it's been put forward as a logical contradiction in your thinking. That if you believe in this kind of God and you believe that evil exists, then you've got an actual contradiction somewhere in your thinking. So Alvin Plantinga, I mentioned that he's usually credited with the guy who destroys the logical version of or turns people away from the logical arguments from evil. He pointed out, is it logically possible? Keep in mind, when you say logically possible, you're not saying it's reasonable, you're not saying it's the best explanation, you're not saying anything else. You're saying, is this at all possible? There are certain things that are impossible. Is this even possible? And so, is it possible that anytime something bad has happened, it's because God respects the free will of the demon or whatever it happens to be that's causing this suffering, and that he allows this because he respects the free will of that being? Even if you want to say that's completely ridiculous, and lots of people would, is it at least hypothetically possible? Is it in the realm? Put it this way: is it not impossible? Most philosophers will understand what you mean by possibility. Of course it's possible. Of course it's possible. As soon as you grant that, as soon as you say it's possible that every time some suffering occurs, it's because a demon is doing something, As long as you say it's possible, then great. You're not talking about a contradiction anymore. The argument is not about a contradiction. The argument is about evidence, and so that's why things turn in the evidential direction. But now that you're talking about the evidential direction, now you're talking about actual theodicies. What are some reasons that that suffering could occur? How do you, as an atheist, say no, that's just stupid that God is allowing demons to do things in the world?
In an internal critique, what you're trying to do is find inconsistencies. You're not trying to argue that something is improbable, right? What you're trying to do as an internal critique is you're going inside this person's worldview, inside this person's own beliefs, and pointing out two different things that they hold that are inconsistent with each other. Like, that's how internal critiques are supposed to work. But if they've got the resources to explain suffering, you don't really have a response. It's no longer an internal critique. It's going to turn into some sort of external critique. I hate this distinction, honestly. I just don't like it at all. But yeah, so if you're going to be using someone's own worldview and they point to something like, you've got this free will theodicy, the fall and stuff, and this cosmic warfare that's going on, and this explains why there's suffering in the world, you no longer have an inconsistent worldview. You might just think that the worldview is like improbable relative to like what you believe, but it's no longer an internal critique. It's something else. And I think that's worth pointing out.
Yeah.
But why don't we let's get to the next clip here. This one, Alex is basically continuing his opening statement. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, one more thing, just for people who are kind of new to this. Why, along the lines of why we have an issue with this being a supposed internal critique, or why we would think that there's a problem with saying that the God of the Bible wouldn't allow animal suffering or something like this, or the kinds of animal suffering. Guys, if you read, so here's the kind of issue. If you read the Bible from beginning to end and you said, okay, if this God exists, what are the chances that you're going to have human and animal suffering? 100%.
Judge,
Right? In other words, if you read the story of this God, if you read the story of the God of the Bible, you say, okay, what's the probability that this God is going to allow human and animal suffering? 100%. And so to say, oh, we've got human and animal suffering, that's a problem for the God of the Bible, there's something weird about that. Now there are ways they could address that, but that's kind of like a sort of first step reaction.
Yeah, well, man, it gets worse than that, because, okay, on the biblical worldview, animal suffering, like, literally probability 100% probability. If you want to ask, like, how likely is it that animal suffering exists if Christianity is true? 100%. And then ask the question, okay, suppose atheism is true. What's the probability that we see animal suffering? That there's a universe, like David outlined earlier. There's a universe. There's a light. The universe is light permitting.
As close to zero as you can possibly be without being zero.
Yeah, exactly. So
you have to say atheism plus all these brute facts plus this plus this plus this. Yeah.
Yeah, and it turns into, I mean, atheists have a very serious problem. They want to couch it as like, oh man, this is such a problem for theists, but actually it's a much bigger problem.
Yeah, I feel like they're calling for 1982 or something.
What? What'd you say?
I feel like they're arguing from 1982, but I mean, was Alex even born then? I don't think he was.
No. No, he was probably born in like 2009.
How old is he?
I don't know.
Can't do quick math. He'd be like 15 years old right now.
Yeah, I'm guessing he's early 20s.
Yeah, no, I think he's like 23 or 24. All right, let's finally get to this clip I've been trying to set up for like the past 30 minutes. All right, in this one he argues, why does where you're born predict whether you're saved? All right, so he kind of moves on to like a different, man, what's a good term for this, Stan? I call it like a geographical type objection.
It's I don't know, it'd be probably a geographical statistic argument or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's whatever it is. It's bad. Let's watch.
Another question. Why is a person's
By the way, Questions, not arguments.
Geographical place of birth a statistically reliable indicator of how likely they are to be saved. This is Stephen Mateson's argument. The populace of Connecticut is around 70% Christian, let alone theistic, whereas the populace of Thailand is 95% Buddhist, and therefore at best 5% theistic. I'm told by St. Paul in Romans that, quote, what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse.
Preach it. Preach
Why
it.
then
Raise Mjolnir in defense of what is right.
should I expect this God to provide more compelling evidence to those in New England than to those in Southeast Asia? Or are the Thai just orders of magnitude more naturally incredulous? And if so, why? How lucky Clifton Stewart must feel to reside in a stronghold of the one true religion, given just how much variance there is out in the world. Again, why is a person's geographical place of birth a reliable statistical indicator of how likely they are to be saved?
Okay. Wait, before, I don't know if you guys wanted to say something, but I'm pausing here because this next part is really important. David, try.
Yeah.
I've got it actually written out, so I'll read it after he says it. But
The rant
but
you
yes,
went on,
listen,
David.
just listen to this. Listen to what he says.
On our hypothesis of atheism, religion is a product not of divine revelation, but of evolved local mythologies and customs, married to political influence and military conquest. Religious beliefs, varying by region and culture in a statistically and historically predictable manner, whilst a trouble for the proposition's theology is not only consistent with our worldview, but expected on it. The same.
Should I just play it again? Or?
No, we got it. I mean, for people who are watching, you might want
Any atheist listening to this, I want you to get me an entailment. Just write out the sentence, God does not exist, and then show me how what falls out of there is what Alex just said.
Okay, this is what he says. I've got it written down. I'm going to read it back out. And it's not going to sound as eloquent because it's coming from me, American accent. On our hypothesis of atheism, religion is a product not of divine revelation, but of evolved local mythologies and customs married to political influence and military conquests. Religious beliefs varying by location and culture in a statistically and historically predictable manner, whilst a trouble for the proposition of theology is not only consistent with our worldview, but expected on it. Think about how many different things he believes is expected on atheism. All of this stuff. Just so, like, again, going back to the way that David set it up. Like, you've got these two different views of the world, right? One of the views is that there's some sort of God. On the other view, you've got that there's no God, okay? Why would you think, on the hypothesis that there is no God, that all of this stuff just suddenly falls? Like, this is exactly what you'd expect. You'd expect there to be religions, that it'd be a product not of divine revelation, but of evolved local mythologies and customs, married to political influence and military conquest. Like, all of this stuff is just suddenly all of this stuff is what we would expect to find if there is no God. That's all that you know. There's no God, and then you just expect all it.
Yeah, yeah, Alex has some massive problems there. Even saying expected, at most, you could say, and I wouldn't even grant him this. At most, what you could say is, if you grant everything else that massively favors theism over atheism, if you granted all of that and we had a world and you said that human beings developed and they started sharing ideas and so on, you spread all of that, you still wouldn't say that what you see around you is what's expected. You'd say more probable on atheism than on the hypothesis that Christianity is true or something like that. And you'd have to defend that. But that he went way beyond that and said it's actually expected. Like, if you just start off with atheism, this is what you'd expect. That is most certainly not what I would expect. And I mean, I find it mind-boggling that someone as intelligent as Alex just said that. Again, I would expect if you're just starting off with no creator, no God or something like that, I would not expect a universe to begin with. Then if you got a universe, what would I expect? Well, I wouldn't expect a life-permitting universe, a finely tuned universe at all. It's massively improbable. And then you just keep going. Would you expect life to develop? No, even if you had a life-permitting universe, I would not expect life to actually develop. And all the atheists who go, oh, but the universe is so big, they do not understand the freaking improbabilities that they're talking about. There are around 10 to the 80th particles in the entire universe. The entire universe contains around 10 to the 80th power particles. You can do the math on this. You can say, okay, 10 to the 80th particles, that's all the particles you have in the entire universe. You can calculate the number of seconds from the Big Bang down to the present. That gives you the longest possible time you have for these particles to interact. And you can multiply that by the fastest rate at which particles could possibly interact. You say, what if they're interacting at the speed of light? Guess what? You can say every particle in the universe interacting at the speed of light for the entire duration of the entire universe. That gives you all the possible particle interactions ever, most possible. There's no more possible at all. And you could do that, and guess what? You're still, probability-wise, you're not getting one medium-length protein by chance anywhere in the universe. You're still not getting one medium-length protein. You need hundreds of them for the simplest imaginable life that we can come up with. So don't just say, oh, it's a big universe. You have no idea with how improbable something like life is. According to Alex, you would just expect it. No, I wouldn't. The point is, I wouldn't expect it. And if you did get life, then what would I expect? I don't know, bacteria or something like that. Am I expecting it to get to a level where you have human beings reflecting on this? Now you have human consciousness and so on. Am I expecting you to get to this level? And then if you do get to this level, am I expecting you to be aware of more objective moral laws and so on? Am I going to expect you to be aware of logical laws and to even come up with a concept of theism? Even that, people don't understand. Years ago, I did a paper at EPS called the Bayesian ontological argument. And I was just, okay, if you start off with theism and say, what's the probability that we would come up with an idea for God? Which does that favor? If you had start off with atheism, what's the probability that we would come up with a concept of God? I said it's massively more probable on theism than it is on atheism that you'd even come up with a concept of God. Where are you getting a concept of some all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good being? It doesn't correspond to anything in your senses. Why are you developing a concept of it, and so on? So anyway, the point is, there's nothing in what Alex is doing. If you take everything that Alex is even arguing, saying, oh, it's expected, there's nothing in his worldview. There's nothing in anything he's saying where I say it's more expected on atheism than it is on theism. Nothing. And there are all kinds of things that are like presupposed in there that if you said, I'm starting with theism or I'm starting with atheism, which makes this evidence more probable? Theism wins every single time. And somehow, again, you're saying, now let's take the big jumbled thing and put it all together. All these individual things, dozens of them, that massively support theism over atheism. Let's say if you put the whole big ball together, it points to atheism, and it's exactly what we would expect. Okay, I can't take you seriously anymore.
Yep. Oh, one thing I wanted to do is actually show you guys a geographical distribution map of the world religions. This is pretty interesting. Okay, so this is Buddhism. As you can see, seems pretty centrally located, right? It centers around over here. We've got China's got some, Mongolia, but mainly in this area over here, right? Let's now switch to Islam. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, so still pretty centrally located in this area. We've got some over here. Right, some Islamic nations over here, majority Islamic nations over here, but mainly in this area. Okay, so Buddhism, Islam seem fairly centrally located. Let's try Hinduism. Okay, again, pretty centrally located. One little area right here, Hinduism. India, no real surprise there. Now, let's look at Christianity. Let's see what Christianity looks like. Or should we do Judaism? Judaism, I think, pretty much you could probably expect Jews to be pretty tight in this area. All right, but let's look at Christianity now.
By the eye of
In your face, Alex.
In your face. Like literally everywhere else. Everywhere else. Literally everywhere else. There is no geographical central location where Christianity is. And this is, I mean, you might say, one might say, this is this type of geographical distribution I would expect for the true religion to look like. It's sort of spreading naturally as people start to consider like the truth claims of this religion. As it starts to spread throughout the world, people start to grasp onto the truth in this way. This is I would expect the true religion to not be centrally located somewhere. Am I the only one?
No, I'm in complete agreement.
And I'm
Go on.
thinking,
Yeah, pretty interesting.
I'm thinking in terms of this being a debate about the coherence of the God of the Bible. When, what are you talking about? The God of the Bible says, go out and preach this. So you have human beings going around preaching. And so human beings are going to be the ones who are spreading the message around the world. Yeah, this is wild stuff. And even then, we're talking about him not giving, not being very philosophically rigorous, because we're aware that there are responses to that. So you can go in a Molinist direction where God is aware of what people are going to, believe and so on, and chooses where they are and so on based on that. And then, you have these questions of how is God going to judge people who live in other places in the world where they don't have access to the gospel, or even if so you have people who've never been evangelized, and then you have people who they call them pseudo-evangelized. Yep. You may have heard the gospel, but you did not hear it in any serious form or something like that. How is God going to judge them and so on? And Alex knows by this point that there are responses to those kinds of things. So this is weird.
Yeah.
All right, let's get to the next clip. This one's about 50 seconds long, but he sort of summarizes his opening statement. And this one contains, I think, probably the most embarrassing line in the debate.
Same is true of animal suffering. What would we expect to see if the world was being supervised by benevolence itself? And what do we find? Natural selection is the mechanism of animal development, which does not just involve, but relies upon death and destruction to the extent that 99.9% of the species, let alone the individual creatures that have ever existed on this planet, have been brutally wiped from existence in some of the most painful ways imaginable. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as death and anguish and suffering of the unfit. I think this is at least unexpected. If we assume naturalism, however, the world is just an amoral arena of accidentally existing organisms fighting in a blind struggle for survival in a world of limited resources. Again, we do not just explain the reality of the world, we also come to expect it.
Okay, so that's not the part that I'm talking about that's embarrassing, but we've already addressed that, right? We don't necessarily need to go over it again. We might do it at some point. But this next line is what I'm talking about. Again, the topic of the...
Oh, no, I just wanted to point out, like, there's something he's saying that is correct there. He's mostly massively incorrect in terms of expectations. I do like that he's arguing kind of a Bayesian fashion. Hey, you take this hypothesis, what would you expect? Pretend you didn't know anything. Pretend you didn't know anything. This is the approach, guys. Pretend you didn't know what you knew, and all you knew is the hypothesis. What would you expect on that hypothesis? What would you expect? And so you take a hypothesis like naturalism, you take a hypothesis like theism and say, what would you expect? And then you open your eyes and say, looking around you, which hypothesis matched up with your expectations best? And you'd say the evidence favors that one over the alternative. What he's saying is, hey, if you just start with naturalism, then all this becomes absolute nonsense. But in his defense, what you'd say is, if you already granted a universe, and if you already granted that it's finely tuned, and if you granted life, and if you granted the big evolutionary picture of how life and all its diversity arose, and if you granted all of this, and then you said, okay, what about animal suffering? Which hypothesis does this fit better, or something like this? Then you'd say, okay, and here's why, ladies and gentlemen, here's why. And Draper argued this. If naturalism is true, and we somehow got to the world we see around us, there's kind of only one game for how you got here, right? You need to start off with something simple that forms by accident, and then it needs to be able to evolve and somehow get to us. In other words, the evolutionary picture is kind of the only game in town on naturalism for how you could get to this. Whereas, if you started with God, could God do the same thing? Could God use evolution and so on? Of course he could. But God would also have a bunch of other ways that he could make life. So God would have a lot of different possible ways of creating a world where you have living things. There's only one way to go about it on naturalism. And so you could say, wait a minute, God could have done it in all these different ways. Why did he do it in the one way that you could get it in naturalism? And so it looks like this favors naturalism. But again, that's if you granted every single step all the way down to life and so on. And I just wouldn't. I would never grant
Right.
that all of those individual things favor naturalism over theism, and then say that the totality does, because it just doesn't. They don't. These things don't fit. In fact, Draper even had a paper where he argued that human and animal suffering is a parallel problem to cosmic fine-tuning. He said naturalism and theism each have a problem. Namely, if you started with naturalism, would you be seriously surprised by the universe being finely tuned for life? He says, well, yeah, that's not surprising at all in theism. It's massively surprising on naturalism. So that's a problem with naturalism. And then he argues that theism, if you had theism, would you expect all the kinds of human and animal suffering we see around us? No, you wouldn't. And therefore, it's evidence favoring naturalism. So he basically says, hey, be an agnostic at the end of it. You have a serious problem with either one. So until you come up with some great tiebreaker, be agnostic about it.
So I think there's actually an argument from fine-tuning, the fine-tuning of actually evil and suffering for the truth of Christianity. All right, let me explain how it goes. It's actually not that difficult. So it just goes like this. On naturalism, on the picture that Alex was outlining, there's still some variability in how much suffering there would be in the world, right? So there could be a lot less suffering. There could be the amount of suffering that we see in the world, but there also could be a whole lot more suffering. So why would we expect this amount of suffering, particularly in which there can be soul building? There can be the type of soul building where, you know, if there was too much suffering in the world, we couldn't really cultivate the virtues, the same types of virtues. Like we wouldn't really be able to express forgiveness if we're just constantly being bombarded with, suffering the whole time. Like we wouldn't really be able to cultivate our character in the same sort of way. And so that's all consistent with naturalism. You could have a lot less suffering. You could have the amount of suffering that we see in the world, that we currently see in the world, or you could have a lot more suffering. Right? And so how do you get the prediction that we have the amount of suffering that we see in the world that just so happens to be the right amount to where we can cultivate these sorts of virtues, like soul building kind of points out, right? The soul building at least points to these different virtues, courage and forgiveness and sacrifice and so on. Mm-hmm. So this actually, I think the specific amount of suffering that we see in the world is actually better predicted on theism than it is on naturalism, even if we grant them all these things in the world. What are your thoughts on that argument, David?
Yeah, I think you could argue that. So if you just have guys, if you just had naturalism,
30 seconds before you attack.
I mean, why not far more suffering? Why not
right.
serious? Yeah. Why not serious, endless bloodbath?
Or again, why anything at all?
Oh yeah, if you're factoring that in, yeah. I'm trying, guys. I'm actually trying to be as favorable as possible. When you're talking about like universe forming, finely tuned universe and so on, like these things, they so massively favor theism over naturalism. There's not even any. They're not even in the same ballpark. Not even in the same ballpark. You don't even have symbols because people will use they'll use the greater than sign to it's more probable in this hypothesis than another, and then they'll add an exclamation point. It's like you would need to add like 100 exclamation points if you actually wanted to picture how much these things favor theism over naturalism. but it's like, yeah, and so granting everything, you could say, okay, well, since this is the only game in town for naturalism, and it kind of fits or something like that. But going along with what Cameron's pointing out, well, if life did develop naturally, we granted you that, and you started getting organisms, sentient organisms. Why not far more? Why not far more? Why is the amount of suffering in our world just the right amount for us to live and flourish, and yet have enough problems and so on, where we can develop virtues and have free will and things like that?
All right, we probably should finish this clip that I said is one of the most embarrassing from the debate. I want to remind the audience really quickly, the debate that they were talking about, like the topic of the debate is whether or not the biblical God exists, and this is where he sort of summarizes his whole thoughts, right? This is the very end of his opening statement, so let's listen to this.
So, an unreliable source pointing to a fragmented God who, despite being the essence of benevolence, designs and consistently oversees systems of untold suffering and sometimes commands its infliction directly himself. The very moral intuition that Cliff and Stuart are relying upon to make a case for God's existence. Well, you know that certain things are right or wrong. You know that's not just a matter of opinion. Are the very moral intuitions that we're invited to discard with when faced with basically anything that the God of the Old Testament does. Does the biblical God exist? I don't even know what biblical God we're talking about. Which one?
Boy.
That's how he ends it. Which biblical God are we talking about?
Yeah, so it's just interesting to me because Christians typically are the ones that get called out for cherry picking the Bible. And it seems like Alex's rhetorical point here rests upon one, I think, just bad readings of various places in the Bible. And then just hyper-focusing on those to say, like, hey, there's a huge distinction between what you see of the God in the Old Testament and the God in the New Testament. And that's, like, the rhetorical point he's trying to make here. And Alex knows the arguments. He knows the scholarship on a lot of these things. He's read the Bible. He knows that he should know there's like I think it's a 6-to-1 ratio that scholars point out when the Old Testament talks about God's characters. There's a 6-to-1 ratio talking about God's goodness and mercy and love in relation to his punishment. Like, Alex should know this stuff. So I'm really miffed about that.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that clip, David? Otherwise, we'll skip forward and actually get some of the back and forth between Cliff and Alex.
What did he say there at the end? So he's talking about the biblical God and suffering, whole difference between Old and New Testaments.
Yeah, I'm trying to pull it back up. He says, he asks rhetorically whether or not the biblical God exists, and then he answers it, I don't even know what biblical God we're talking about. He's trying to pit the Old Testament depiction of God against the New Testament depiction of God. That's what he does earlier on in the opening statement that we didn't actually cover. I forget that you didn't watch the...
It's interesting because... there's you wonder why they're trying to put this as an internal critique, right? You're being asked to put this to consider this an internal critique. There's a reason for saying that, guys, because if it's an external critique, then you could ask them about where they're getting their values that they're using to judge God, right? So there are multiple problems that come up when you say a good God would not allow this. The moment you say something like that, which historically lots of atheists say, if God existed, he would not do this. When you say that, you're acknowledging that there are moral laws that are so universal that they would not just apply to any human being, they would even apply to God if he existed. Right? So you're saying two things. One, you're saying there are these moral laws, and two, you're saying you have access to them. You are aware of them. Neither one of those things makes any sense in atheism. One, that there are these rules that if God existed, even God would have to obey these rules. Like, it doesn't make sense for you to be thinking of rules that are like that. Oh, if God existed, he would be following this law because every conscious being would have to follow this law. Okay, you're saying there are certain kinds of laws that everyone has to follow. So that's one problem. Two, why would you be the kind of thing that has access to knowing what rules God is going to have to follow? In other words, you're saying something that makes no sense given what you think you are on atheism. You are a fancy, as Richard Dawkins put it, you're a machine for propagating DNA. Why, in the name of common sense, would you be aware of laws that would apply to anything, even things far, far different from yourself? What sense does this make? It makes none. So the fact that you're even capable of moral reasoning and so on issues like this, that actually favors theism over naturalism, even while you're arguing against theism. So that's why you'd want to say it's an internal critique. We're not saying that there are these things that God wouldn't allow. You're saying by these things that you say about God, you're the one saying within your worldview that there are these things that God wouldn't allow. And the problem with that is
There's multiple problems.
There are multiple problems, but one. No, if you're actually an internal critique, like you're a person who is within this worldview, and you actually said, okay, what do we have about the God of the Bible? Is that inconsistent with suffering? No, it's not. So you're clearly standing from without and judging this as inadequate, and it's morally defective, and this doesn't work, and so on. You're clearly still appealing to the idea that you are aware of all these things, that you should not, you shouldn't believe the things you're saying. If you're a naturalist, you should not believe that there are these rules that you can apply to judging the entire picture and so on. Not morally, not using your reason. You don't have the kind of, given what you are according to your worldview, you should not trust your own cognitive faculties in dealing with these kinds of issues. So that's, to me, kind of the big picture. It's even as you're blasting away and saying that you're using an internal critique against the God of the Bible and so on, you're not. And every single thing that you're doing, if I were to say what is required for Alex to be arguing as he is arguing right now, everything that's required favors theism over naturalism. And that's why I could just never take the argument seriously. Once you get your mind around that, how everything involved even in making the argument. See, one, you need a universe. If we're arguing, we're arguing within a universe, so you need a universe. If we're living things, so you need a finely tuned universe. You need living things. We're arguing about living things. You need human consciousness. You need human reason. You need objective moral values that you're applying in these discussions. You need logical laws to formulate arguments. Every single thing that you need to even be making your argument right now massively favors theism over naturalism. And somehow you conclude, therefore, naturalism and God of the Bible doesn't exist. And it sounds insane to me.
Also, notice, I'm using your terminology. That's what you do a lot in your streams, David. Notice. So what you were doing earlier is you were being very charitable. You were like, let's grant these different things to the naturalists in order to like grant them this, sort of inference that they're trying to draw here. But the theist has been granted nothing. Like, we grant us something. Like, if you want to talk about like building something into your worldview that's going to explain what we see in the world, why can't we do that? Why can't we build in something to Christianity? Why can't we add, for example, they get a lot of mileage out of adding evolution to atheism. They'll be like, okay, well, if you just give us evolution, we can explain why there's suffering in the world, why there's animal predation, and why there's millions of years of animal suffering. If you just
nothing. Sorry.
But if we're giving the atheist evolution,
everything. Sorry.
What is that from?
That's from 300. Because give them nothing, but take from them everything.
Oh, now I remember. Yeah, no, it's been a long time since I've seen that one.
Dang, that's a throwback.
That is a throwback. No, what was I saying? You threw me off here.
I'm sorry.
David.
I'm sorry.
Can't give us something like if the atheist can do it, the theist should be able to do it. But when we do it, it's like illicit, right? We can't do that. It's not. You just can't do it. Christians can't add things to their hypothesis in order to explain the data. Only atheists are allowed to do that. And again, like, what was Alex doing? He was basically telling a story from an atheistic perspective. Like, oh yeah, well, there's military conquest and there's political reasons why religion has spread and stuff. And he's telling a story. Well, why can't Christians tell some just random story they just happen to, throw out there? And why can't that be conjoined to Christianity in order to explain animal suffering? That seems a little bit odd, but that's exactly what atheists do, and they get away with it. It's really weird.
Well, I do want to add this on, Cameron. Notice that the way we do things, that Christians do, at least the philosophers and theologians do things,
We do it
they'll
right.
actually
They
make a
do
good
it.
argument that entails their theodicy, or like animal universalism or something like that. Like, we went over an argument that entails it. We're not just tacking something on that's going to burden our theory. We're just showing that our theory kind of entails this. Whereas the atheist can't entail evolution and all this other stuff on top of that. They're actually incurring something. They're actually doing ad hoc reasoning there. Whereas the Christian has a lot of these explanatory resources to build the story in a way that isn't going to be burdensome to the theory.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The Christians have the explanatory
Building
resources.
blocks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Explanatory
And guys,
resources on which they can do this legitimately, whereas the atheist
that-
doesn't have that.
yeah, that is one of the most massive differences between these two things. If you ask, why would God allow this? Okay, you don't have a problem with why the universe got there. You got the universe. You got God. You can get a universe. You don't have a problem with the fine-tuning of the universe. You don't have a problem with life forming. All that's no problem for God. That's all easy for God. All the stuff. And then when you get to why would God allow this, given that He's created all these things, then it's what reasons does God have? Well, guess what? God can have all kinds of reasons. Some reasons that we're aware of and reasons that are vastly beyond our comprehension. But if you take the hypothesis seriously, even as an atheist, and this is what William Rowe eventually concluded, of course God could have all kinds of reasons for things. Yes, even reasons that we can't even come close to. We're not even in the right ballpark of being able to understand these reasons. If you start with naturalism, it's not just that you're not talking about reasons. There are no reasons until you get to human beings who might have reasons for things and so on, but you're not dealing with reasons, and you have no serious explanation for all these other things. And it's like, that is like the definition of a bankrupt worldview. You can't explain anything to get you to the things, and then on top of it, you have no reasons. And you're complaining about our worldview when we can explain all this stuff, and then we're talking about, well, we may not have full access to God's reasons for doing things, but we can sort of discuss them and compare them and so on, and do stuff that we're kind of created to do as the image of God. And the atheist looks at it and says, but I'm not convinced by that reason. You see, naturalism, a theory that explains literally nothing.
All right, this next clip, let's go ahead and watch some more of the debate now. All right, this next clip is about...
I did just have to make a quick announcement, powerful announcement. You're at 2,032 people viewing right now. A certain other live stream right now is at 1,718, so hundreds behind this one. So I just want to say, if you're watching Inspiring Philosophies live stream right now, you're kind of a loser. But you're watching us right now, so you're a winner.
Yes. All right, thanks for that announcement, David.
You
All
were
right, this
disappointed, that's why.
this next clip, David, I'm gonna rely on you to stop me when you want to make a comment, because this one's about 10 minutes long. I'll obviously stop it too if I have something that I want to say, but this one a little bit on the longer side, and the reason why I want to play it is because this is a back and forth between Cliff, we haven't heard from Cliff yet, and Alex. And I don't know if Phil has any input in this section, but this back and forth is nevertheless kind of interesting, but it's also, I think, representative of the rest of the debate. So let's just start watching.
About adding something to the Quran. I have, I guess, two questions that I want to ask you, Cliff. The first is this. Do you agree with the scholarly consensus, the biblical scholarship that is, that both the long ending of the Gospel of Mark and also the story of the adulterous woman in John's Gospel were added later than the earliest manuscripts, were later interpolations of the text?
Due to the precise nature.
Hang on. I don't know if he's going to explain this, but what would that have to... I'm wondering what that has to do with the debate, whether the God of the Bible exists.
Yeah.
Like, I don't understand why he's bringing this up. I don't know what the background was, why he'd be bringing this up. Talking about
While you're
textual
trying to-
criticism right now.
While you're
Dan,
thinking
do you
on that,
remember?
I do want to just point this out too. I don't think it's the consensus that this is a later made up or fabricated, like historically fabricated edition. The consensus is that the ending of Mark is unknown, and there's a debate about what the historicity of the traditions that are there between the short or long ending, what actually happened, or what the intention there is supposed to be. It's not consensus that Mark people just added in some made up historical facts into into Mark, and that's what's going on. So Alex is wrong there. I'm just pointing that out.
Yeah, Nabil
Yeah.
Nabil did his master's thesis at Oxford on this, but his view was that we know that Christians were going around preaching, and his view was that the creed in 1 Corinthians, you have a list of people who had witnessed the risen Christ, but Paul mentions the 500 people seeing the risen Christ. And so he believes that you had the apostles and other people who were going around preaching. He believed that Mark was written sort of, according to the tradition, that it was written as the testimony of Peter, that Mark is being written according to the teachings of Peter, but it's basically as the background to their preaching of the appearance of the risen Christ. In other words, you're preaching, hey, Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to me. Okay, what do we need to know about Jesus? Okay, here's the Gospel of Mark, but it leads right up to Jesus' death and the tomb being empty. And the reason that it cuts off according to that theory, is because that's when you're supposed to talk about that's when the preacher was supposed to share his story of the risen Jesus. And what you would have in the longer and the shorter version of the ending of Mark is someone actually included a person's story, and another one included another person's ending, and so on. Is that correct? I don't know, but that's kind of the point. There are all kinds of reasons for why we might. Yeah, there's tons of hypotheses rather than just some forger forged something
Exactly.
later.
Yeah, well, the way that this kind of ties in is that he wants to say, well, if people were adding stuff to the text, then couldn't they have been doing that in other places? And so therefore, should we really trust the Bible more generally? And then that's
Wait, is that what he's arguing?
Whether or not let's keep playing the clip, because I think he makes his point clear, and I think Stuart also interacts with him.
Okay.
But I think that's ultimately what he does try to get
That would
at.
be
He does say that explicitly. What'd you say, Than?
If that was this argument, I think the implications he wants to draw, I don't think that actually follows. But I'll expand.
Yeah,
Wait,
Let's keep
and
listening.
I just wanted to point out, if that is his point, it actually, I would say, works in the reverse
Against his
because
favor.
You
Yeah.
can only we can spot something like the different endings of Mark because we have tons of manuscripts and people were quoting these things and so on, and that allows us to say, oh, actually, we have an issue right here.
Yeah.
So to conclude, therefore, it's just you can't trust any of it. That's the opposite conclusion.
The
I
fact
would
that we
draw.
can identify forgeries or interpolations in the text tell us what we can test against to know and have more confidence in what the originals actually said.
Yeah, that's on the textual criticism side, but I think on the question of whether or not the Gospels, the New Testament is reliable, there's also positive arguments for that, which I don't know that we'll get into those in this show, but let's just keep playing this clip and try to get Alex's thoughts here. But one of the things I want to highlight in this clip is that they talk about the possibility or impossibility on Cliff's part, or Cliff argues that agnosticism is impossible. That's kind of what I want to get to in this clip, but they do talk about that in just a little bit. So let's just keep playing this.
The manuscript evidence from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There is serious question whether the end of Mark chapter 16 was an addition or whether it was part of the original writing. The same is true for John chapter 7, the end of 7, and the first 11 verses of John 8. There is serious question due to the fact those passages are not found in the earliest Greek manuscripts that we have, whether those additions or not. Now, Alex, please answer the question. What is more reasonable than the God of the New Testament? Who or what do you put your faith in that is based on more evidence of reliability?
So earlier in his opening statement, Cliff was his basic argument was that he's had his own share of doubts, and that he basically thinks that Christian theism is the most reasonable worldview compared to the other worldviews, the other worldview options that are out there. Not an unreasonable thing to argue, right? We've been talking about that pretty much this entire time, that if you come from the perspective of an atheist and your worldview is atheism, there is no God, what would you actually expect to see in the world if that was your hypothesis, if that was your worldview? And Cliff is asking Alex explicitly, why is your worldview more likely than mine?
Mm-hmm. And by the way, that is important little. This is one of the most important ideas for atheists to get, because what you've seen, especially since the rise of the new atheism, is, hey, prove that your God exists, and I'm going to sit back and play skeptic.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you can play skeptic about anything. If I didn't want to believe that Alex O'Connor exists, could I come up with alternatives? Yeah, aliens are tricking me. Maybe I'm dreaming. Maybe I just imagine it. Maybe there's a guy going around pretending to be Alex O'Connor and there is no real Alex O'Connor. You could come up with all sorts of explanations if you wanted to play skeptic. So that is